They say music is the universal language, notes flowing across borders, across languages, across walls built by politics and ideology. But what happens when music is not just sound, but cover? When a song becomes a passport and a melody becomes the perfect disguise? This is the story of a man who played more than just instruments. He played nations against each other, a musician who carried not only a guitar case, but secrets. A man whose stage was not only the concert hall, but the Cold War. This is the story of the musician who spied for the CIA. It begins in the 1950s. The Cold War was in its early act, a silent opera of suspicion between East and West. Washington feared the Soviets, Moscow feared the Americans, and both sides believed culture, art, literature, music could win hearts and minds as powerfully as any missile. The CIA quietly had begun something extraordinary, a cultural Cold War. Jazz, especially, became their weapon. The music of freedom, the improvisation of democracy. Louis Armstrong, Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, they toured abroad, often with government support, carrying the sound of America into Soviet-influenced countries. But beneath the swing of saxophones, another rhythm played, hidden operations, carefully orchestrated. And somewhere in this clandestine orchestra was our man, a musician whose name rarely makes the history books. He wasn't a household name, he wasn't Duke Ellington or Miles Davis, but he had what the CIA loved most in an agent: charm, access, a believable reason to be anywhere in the world. His real name? We'll call him Michael. Not his birth name, not his code name, but a name for the story, because his real identity still drifts in the shadows of classified archives. Michael was a pianist, a good one, not famous, but good enough to play embassies, consulates, smoky bars in Berlin, cultural festivals in Belgrade. He had an ear for languages. He could talk to anyone, a KGB officer, a Hungarian poet, a French diplomat. And in 1956, someone from the American embassy tapped him on the shoulder. They admired his performance. They said his music could be more than just music. Would he like to help his country? At first, Michael thought it was a joke. Him? A spy? He wasn't James Bond. He didn't even own a proper tuxedo. But the offer lingered. He'd seen tanks in Budapest. He'd watched refugees pour westward. He hated what he'd heard about Stalin's prisons, the silencing of artists. So when the CIA asked if he'd carry messages, observe conversations, pass along whispers he overheard at cocktail parties after his concerts, he said yes. And just like that, the pianist became an operative. His cover was airtight because it wasn't a cover. He really was a musician. And in those years, music was the ultimate passport. Where businessmen were watched, where diplomats were followed, musicians were invited. Concerts were seen as harmless. Artists were expected to be eccentric, to drink too much, to talk to everyone. Michael drifted easily through circles most Americans could never touch. He played Chopin for communist officials, then jazz riffs for young dissidents. He lingered at after-parties where vodka flowed and tongues loosened. And all the while, his mind recorded everything. The beauty and danger of being a musical spy was the intimacy. Unlike soldiers or politicians, musicians touched people's emotions. Michael wasn't just listening to words, he was listening to feelings. In Warsaw, a cellist whispered to him about a cousin jailed for anti-Soviet poems. In Prague, a young woman slipped him banned sheet music, Bartok, forbidden by the regime. In Belgrade, he overheard a Yugoslav officer ranting about Moscow's arrogance. To most, it was bar talk. To Michael, it was intelligence. But there was another side to it, one harder to talk about. Because the more Michael spied, the more he wondered, was he still an artist, or had he become just another instrument of power? He noticed something. The CIA didn't just want secrets about military bases, they wanted to shape culture itself. Funds were quietly given to certain artists, magazines, orchestras. The agency helped publish novels critical of communism. They sponsored art exhibits in Paris, New York, Rome. Even the Congress for Cultural Freedom, a famous intellectual movement, was secretly CIA-backed. Michael realized he wasn't just gathering secrets, he was part of a global symphony of influence. And sometimes that influence turned dangerous. In 1961, during a tour in East Berlin, Michael's group was invited to a private party hosted by a cultural officer linked to the Stasi, East Germany's feared secret police. Music was played, wine was poured, but halfway through the evening, Michael realized the laughter was too forced, the questions too sharp. One man asked about his travels in Belgrade, another asked who he knew in Warsaw, and then someone requested he play the American national anthem, half smiling as if testing him. Michael's heart pounded. He excused himself, claiming a headache, and left quickly. Later, he learned that one of the Stasi's favorite games was to catch Westerners in contradictions. Had he stayed longer, he might not have walked out at all. Still, he continued, year after year, country after country, playing piano on the surface, gathering whispers underneath. And the CIA loved his work. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't reckless, but he was steady. He gave them maps of loyalties inside ministries, rumors of factional fights in communist parties, even names of Soviet officers too drunk to keep quiet. But then, something shifted. By the 1970s, the world was changing. Rock was replacing jazz as the soundtrack of rebellion. Vietnam had scarred America's image, and détente, the easing of tensions, meant fewer covert cultural wars. Michael felt obsolete. The CIA gave him fewer assignments. Sometimes months would pass with nothing. And yet he still traveled, still played. He still carried the weight of what he'd done. But in his quiet moments, he began to ask, had his music been his own? Or had it always been just another kind of weapon? It's here that the story blurs. Officially, Michael retired. Unofficially, rumors swirl. Some say he was caught in Eastern Europe and traded in a spy swap, though no record confirms it. Others whisper he returned to America and taught music at a small college, never telling his students who he was. The truth may remain locked in classified archives, buried under redactions. But what's undeniable is this: Michael was part of something real, a secret history where musicians carried more than melodies. And here's the haunting question. If music is the universal language, what does it mean when that language is used for espionage? When songs meant to heal, to connect, become tools of power and manipulation? Michael believed he was serving freedom, and maybe he was. Maybe some of the whispers he passed on prevented wars, saved lives. But he also carried the guilt of knowing that trust, intimacy, and art, the purest parts of being human, had been turned into weapons. When I think about him, I picture a man at a piano in some dimly lit bar, hands moving gracefully over the keys. The audience sees a musician, but in his eyes, behind the notes, there's something else. A weight, a secret, perhaps even a question that never left him. Did the music serve the man, or did the man serve the music.
And maybe that's why his story matters today. Because in every era, art can be used by governments, by corporations, by ideologies. What begins as expression can become persuasion. What begins as beauty can become strategy. And so, when we listen, whether to jazz, rock, hip-hop, or pop, we should ask ourselves, whose song are we really hearing? Whose purpose does it serve? Michael's name may never be famous, but his story lingers like the echo of a piano chord in an empty hall, a reminder that even music, the most human of languages, can be played as a weapon, and that sometimes the sweetest melody hides the deepest secrets. This was The Musician Who Spied for the CIA. And maybe in the end, it isn't about espionage at all. Maybe it's about us, and how easily even the purest notes can be bent by power. So the next time you hear a song that moves you, ask yourself, is it just music, or is it something more? Because sometimes the most beautiful songs carry the heaviest silence. The story begins not with a gun or a secret file, but with a piano. A piano sitting in a smoky bar in Berlin, 1958. The Cold War is tightening its grip on the world, and music, as innocent as it seems, is about to be used as a weapon. Because in the middle of that haze, a man steps onto the stage. His name is Dave Brubeck. To the crowd, he is just a jazz pianist, cool, American, exotic. But to the CIA, he is something else entirely. At the height of the Cold War, America faced a question. How do you fight an ideology without firing a bullet? How do you reach hearts and minds in places where propaganda was stronger than truth? The answer, someone at Langley believed, was not bombs, but jazz. It sounds almost absurd now, the CIA funding concerts, records, and tours, but it was real. And in that mission, musicians like Brubeck, Dizzy Gillespie, and even Louis Armstrong became unwitting soldiers in a silent war. Imagine for a moment you are Brubeck, arriving in Poland in 1958. The government calls jazz decadent. They censor records, shut down clubs, ban broadcasts. But when you play Take the A Train, the crowd erupts. Students climb onto chairs, their fists pumping, their hearts ignited by rhythms forbidden in their country. For them, jazz isn't just music. It is freedom, syncopated, improvised, alive. And the CIA is watching. Because if a few chords can inspire hope, perhaps they can also crack the Iron Curtain. The operation was called Jazz Diplomacy. The agency never admitted it openly, but declassified documents now tell us these tours weren't accidents. They were meticulously planned, funded, and guided by US intelligence. Musicians were told they were ambassadors of goodwill. What they weren't told was that their itineraries were sometimes chosen by spies. But here is where the story takes a darker turn. Because being a musical spy wasn't just about playing concerts. It was about being seen. It was about carrying America's story into places where cameras and diplomats couldn't go. And in some cases, it was about gathering information. One former official recalled, they had access to people we never could. A musician can sit in a cafe with locals, laugh with them, drink with them, and no one suspects espionage. The saxophone case could hide more than an instrument. The sheet music could carry more than notes. Take Louis Armstrong, In 1960, he was sent to the Congo, a country torn apart after independence from Belgium. What the world didn't know, Armstrong's tour coincided with a CIA-backed operation to install a pro-Western government. While Satchmo played to adoring crowds, spies worked in the shadows. The concerts distracted the press, gave the agency cover, and projected America's cultural power at the exact moment politics demanded it. Did Armstrong know? Probably not. But ignorance didn't erase complicity. And then there was Dizzy Gillespie, charismatic, loud, impossible to control. The CIA tried to recruit him for more direct missions, but Dizzy, ever the rebel, reportedly laughed in their faces. "If you think I'm gonna carry a briefcase of secrets, you're crazy. I'll play my trumpet, and that's all you'll get." But even without consent, his tours became tools of the state. The musicians themselves were torn. Some believed in the mission. They hated communism. They wanted to show the world the real America, a place of freedom, improvisation, possibility. But others felt betrayed. Because how could they be ambassadors of freedom when back home, Black Americans still faced segregation, violence, and second-class citizenship? Imagine Armstrong smiling in front of African crowds, telling them America was the land of equality, and then returning to a country where he couldn't sit in certain restaurants. The hypocrisy was heavy, and the notes, no matter how sweet, couldn't drown it out. Dave Brubeck himself began asking questions. By the mid-1960s, he suspected the government wasn't just sponsoring culture, but actively using it for influence. And that's when he did something extraordinary. He wrote a musical called The Real Ambassadors, a biting, satirical piece that exposed the very contradictions of America's jazz diplomacy. On stage, singers belted lines like, "The State Department has discovered jazz. It reaches folks like nothing ever has." The show poked fun at officials, highlighted racial hypocrisy, and celebrated musicians as the true ambassadors, not the politicians hiding behind them. It was bold, it was dangerous, and it was Brubeck's way of reclaiming truth. But here is the question that lingers. Were these musicians heroes or pawns? Did they liberate minds or manipulate them? In Eastern Europe, many who attended those concerts described them as life-changing. A young Polish man once recalled, "After hearing jazz live, I knew the government was lying to us. I knew there was another world out there." For him, Brubeck wasn't a spy. He was a prophet, a reminder that freedom could be heard, even if it couldn't yet be lived. And yet, in Langley, Virginia, the agency checked another box. Influence achieved, mission accomplished. That clash between art and agenda, between sincerity and strategy, is the haunting shadow of jazz diplomacy. Today, when we think of the CIA, we imagine covert drones, cyber operations, and political coups. But in the 1950s and 60s, one of their sharpest weapons was music. It was culture as camouflage, trumpets instead of tanks, saxophones instead of spies. And though the Cold War has ended, the echoes of that strategy remain. Because the question is not, did it work? The question is, at what cost? When you listen to Take 5 today, it is easy to forget the hidden context, the invisible wars stitched between the notes. But if you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The sound of freedom colliding with manipulation, of joy wrapped inside propaganda, of truth
struggling to breathe through power. It is a reminder that art is never neutral. It can liberate, it can deceive, it can heal. And yes, it can spy. And maybe that's the tragedy and the beauty of this story. That somewhere in a concert hall in Warsaw, a boy heard Brubeck's chords and decided to believe in freedom. That somewhere in Kinshasa, a young woman saw Armstrong and felt America was not just a country, but an idea. And that somewhere in Langley, Virginia, an analyst wrote a report claiming victory for the CIA. Three truths, all colliding in the same moment, all born from the same song.
So the next time you hear jazz drifting from a bar, remember, it is not just music. It is history. It is diplomacy. It is resistance. And sometimes it is espionage. The musician who spied for the CIA wasn't just one man. It was an entire orchestra of souls caught in the dissonance of politics and art. And the echoes still play on. The musician steps onto the stage. The crowd erupts, the lights flare, and for a brief moment, all anyone sees is an artist, an entertainer. But behind the curtain, in the silence between chords, there was another story being written. A story of secrets and surveillance. A story where music wasn't just melody, it was camouflage. This is the story of the musician who spied for the CIA. In the Cold War, music carried more than rhythm. It carried ideology. Jazz, for example, became a weapon. American jazz musicians were sent overseas, not just as cultural ambassadors, but as proof that freedom could swing harder than tyranny. And then there were individuals, artists who seemed ordinary, touring, recording, signing autographs, yet slipped into meetings no camera could see. One of them lived two lives, one life of applause, another of whispers. Imagine the contradiction. By day, you're adored by fans, celebrated for your talent. By night, you're sliding envelopes across foreign cafe tables or memorizing what was said at a dinner with a diplomat who had no idea you weren't just a musician. The CIA knew something simple. Nobody suspects the guitarist in the corner or the singer who just got off stage. Musicians travel. Musicians observe. Musicians are invited everywhere. And in those spaces, the quiet corners of power, a song could mask the sound of secrets being exchanged. But here's what most people forget. It wasn't glamorous. The musician wasn't James Bond. There were no tuxedos, no Aston Martins, no martinis, shaken, not stirred. There was fear. Because every time he boarded a plane with his guitar case, he wasn't just carrying an instrument. He was carrying risk. One wrong word, one suspicious customs officer, and he could vanish into a prison cell on foreign soil. His fans back home would never know what happened. Music gave him entry, but it also gave him cover. He'd perform in smoky clubs where government officials happened to sit in the front row. Between sets, he'd strike up casual conversations. Those conversations would drift into politics, and behind the smile, behind the laughter, he'd be memorizing every detail. What was said, how it was said, what it revealed about the cracks in the system. The CIA didn't always need blueprints or code words. Sometimes they needed moods, atmospheres. Who was disillusioned? Who was corruptible? Who was already questioning the regime? And who better to pick up those whispers than a musician who knew how to listen? But this story isn't just about espionage. It's about the cost of living in two worlds. Because the applause felt real, the music felt alive, but the silence after each concert, the moment the crowds dispersed, that was when the weight pressed hardest. He couldn't tell his bandmates.
He couldn't tell his family. He couldn't tell anyone. Every night, he had to lock the truth inside himself. And so the music became both his liberation and his prison. There's a haunting beauty to this paradox. Because while governments saw music as propaganda, the musician himself never lost sight of its humanity. On stage, he gave people joy. Off stage, he gave his handlers information. But in his heart, he wondered, am I betraying the art I love? Or am I proving its power in the deepest way possible? Because if a melody can hide a secret, doesn't that mean music holds more power than anyone dares to admit? The world of espionage is littered with forgotten names. Operatives whose files remain redacted, whose lives were buried beneath official silence. This musician was one of them. Some say he regretted it, that after the Cold War ended, when the ideological battles shifted, he felt like a pawn discarded from the game. Others say he stood by what he did, that he believed music gave him a rare shield, that it allowed him to see history up close, and that he played his role with courage. We may never know his private truth, but what we do know is this: music has always been more than sound. Think about it. During slavery in America, spirituals were sung not just for hope, but as coded messages for escape. During World War II, soldiers carried harmonicas to the front, not for entertainment, but to remind them of home, of something worth surviving for. And in the Cold War, jazz and rock and roll weren't just songs. They were statements. Statements that said, this is freedom. This is the sound of possibility. So, is it really surprising that a musician could become a spy? Perhaps it was inevitable. But here's the question that lingers long after the records have stopped spinning. When the crowd cheered, did he hear admiration? Or did he hear suspicion? Did every clap echo with the fear that someone, somewhere, might already know his secret? And what about us, the listeners? When we put on a record, when we hum along to a melody, we believe it's pure, untouched, a direct line to the artist's soul. But what if, hidden inside, there were fingerprints of geopolitics? What if behind your favorite ballad there was a memo written in Langley, Virginia, directing where that musician would fly next? That is the haunting truth of history. The things we cherish, the songs, the performances, the fleeting beauty of art, are never entirely separate from the machinery of power. But that doesn't diminish the art. If anything, it proves its resilience. Because no matter how it was used, no matter who stood behind the curtain, the music still reached us. It still moved us. And maybe that is its greatest victory. In the end, the musician who spied for the CIA was both more and less than legend. He wasn't a hero in a comic book. He wasn't a villain in a shadowy plot. He was human, flawed, fearful, gifted, torn between the love of his art and the weight of his secret. He lived a life most of us could never imagine, standing on stage beneath the lights and then walking off into the darkness of espionage. But maybe that's why his story matters, because it reminds us that history isn't just battles and treaties. It's individuals, it's choices, it's the strange, fragile threads that connect culture and power, beauty and betrayal, sound and silence. So the next time you hear a melody that stirs something in you, remember this: music has always been more than entertainment. It has been a shield, a weapon, a message, a secret. And somewhere out there, long after his final performance, a musician's ghost is still playing. Not just for applause, not just for art, but for the invisible story hidden in every note. The musician who spied for the CIA. And the reminder that behind every song
there may be a silence that speaks louder than sound.